Christianity was not born from truth. It was constructed from 10 of the most audacious lies ever told, and the first one begins with a myth so cunning it fooled billions for centuries, the claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. You have probably heard the story your entire life that Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem for a Roman census, and as a result Jesus was born there, conveniently fulfilling the prophecy in the Hebrew scriptures. But here is the problem. There is no historical record of any Roman census requiring people to return to their ancestral hometowns. That idea is not just unusual, it is unprecedented, illogical, and entirely inconsistent with how Roman censuses actually worked. Romans taxed and counted people where they lived, not where their ancestors once lived 1,000 years earlier. So why invent such a bizarre premise? Because the Hebrew prophecy in the book of Micah said the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem. That prophecy was well known by first-century Jews and early Christian authors. But if Jesus was from Nazareth, as everyone seemed to agree, then the story needed to be twisted to match the prophecy, and that is exactly what the Gospels of Matthew and Luke attempted to do, each fabricating different and conflicting stories to get Mary to Bethlehem. But ask yourself this, if Jesus was really born in Bethlehem, why do the earliest Gospel, Mark, and even Paul, the earliest Christian writer, never mention it? Paul, writing only 20 years after Jesus supposedly lived, never says a word about Bethlehem. He never says Jesus was born of a virgin either. That entire narrative was added later. This brings us to lie number 2, the fabricated genealogies of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew gives a genealogy that runs through David's son Solomon, while Luke gives an entirely different one through David's son Nathan. Not only that, but they contradict each other on virtually every generation between David and Jesus. Some defenders say one genealogy is for Mary, the other for Joseph, but the texts both clearly state they are for Joseph. And here lies the core contradiction. If Jesus was born of a virgin, then Joseph's lineage would be meaningless to Jesus' divine bloodline. Yet the evangelists go to great lengths to prove Joseph was descended from David, as if that somehow made Jesus the legal heir. But if Jesus had no biological father, he could not inherit anything from Joseph. This theological contradiction was so messy, it should have unraveled the entire narrative. And yet, instead of asking hard questions, most people just absorbed the tale without ever noticing how completely illogical it was. But it gets worse, because lie number 3 is perhaps the most pivotal of all, the virgin birth itself. Christians have been told for centuries that Isaiah prophesied a virgin would give birth to the Messiah, but that is a mistranslation. The Hebrew word used in Isaiah is alma, which simply means young woman, not virgin. When the Hebrew Bible was translated into Greek centuries later, the version called the Septuagint, the word was incorrectly translated as Parthenos, which can mean virgin. And that mistranslation, that single word error, was used as the foundation for one of the most defining doctrines in all of Christianity. Think about that. A mistranslation of a single word was used to invent the virgin birth of Jesus, a concept so central to the Christian faith that questioning it is considered heresy in many circles. And yet, the original Hebrew text never said anything about a virgin. What does it mean when the most sacred miracle of Jesus' origin story, the claim that his mother was a virgin, is built not on history, not on biology, not even on prophecy, but on a translator's error? And why did the Gospel of Mark, the earliest one written, never mention a virgin birth at all? Because it had not been invented yet. That is right. The earliest Gospel authors never even claimed Jesus was born of a virgin. That story appears only in Matthew and Luke, which were written decades later, and they do not even agree on the details. Matthew says Joseph wanted to divorce Mary quietly. Luke says he never doubted her at all. These are not just harmless inconsistencies. These are contradictions that undermine the credibility of the most critical claims in the entire faith. Ask yourself, would the truth need so much creative editing? Would the truth need to contradict itself at every turn? Would the truth need to fabricate a travel scenario, invent a census, mistranslate a prophecy, and splice together two irreconcilable genealogies just to make the pieces fit? Or is it more likely that these were the efforts of storytellers trying to make their character fulfill ancient expectations, retrofitting their theology into the mold of Jewish messianic prophecy to win over skeptical converts? And if the earliest Christians were already this willing to invent, what else were they capable of creating later on? What began as a movement of apocalyptic preachers evolved into a full-blown religion with carefully curated stories and doctrines. But the lies that built Christianity did not stop at the birth of Jesus. They only got more dramatic from there. If the foundation is false, how strong can the structure truly be? We have only just begun uncovering the historical fabrications that propped up the greatest story ever sold. The virgin birth, the genealogies, and the journey to Bethlehem are not sacred facts. They are literary tools, narrative inventions, and theological traps designed to deceive the masses and solidify control. You were not told these stories so you could ask questions. You were told them so you would stop thinking. But today we break that spell, and once you see how it started, you will never be able to unsee what comes next. Because these are just the first 3 lies in a web of 10, and what follows will shake the very core of Christian history. If the birth story was already a calculated lie, then what about the rest of Jesus' life? Why does it vanish from history? Lie number 4 is perhaps the most deafening silence in the entire historical record. The idea that Jesus, this miracle-performing, crowd-drawing, temple-flipping figure who allegedly attracted thousands and shook the foundations of Jewish and Roman power, left behind no contemporary historical trace whatsoever. Not one word, not one mention, not a single sentence written during his lifetime by anyone. Not a Roman, not a Greek, not even a Jew, despite the fact that Palestine was under constant surveillance, record-keeping, and documentation by multiple imperial and religious authorities. Think about that for a moment. We have detailed records about obscure peasant uprisings, minor Jewish prophets and political prisoners from the 1st century, but nothing about the man who supposedly fed 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and raised the dead in public view. How can that be? Because it never happened. The Jesus described in the Gospels is not just a figure with no footprint, he is a literary ghost. This leads us directly into lie number 5, the myth of the 500 witnesses. In Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, written around the year 55, he makes a bold claim that over 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus. That sounds impressive, even definitive. But who were they? Where are their names? Where are their accounts? Why did no one write down this stunning moment in history besides Paul? And even he gives no details whatsoever. No location, no dates, no cross-references, no independent confirmations. It is a phantom crowd. And worse yet, the Gospels written after Paul never mention this massive event. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all of whom supposedly had access to the core stories of Jesus' life, never echo Paul's claim about 500 people witnessing the resurrection. How do you explain that? You cannot. Unless the event never occurred, and Paul made it up to bolster the new religion he was inventing. Let that sink in. The earliest claim of the resurrection is made by a man who never met Jesus in life, who was not present at the crucifixion, and whose version of Jesus was formed entirely through visions and mystical experiences, not real-world events. Now comes lie number 6, and it is the one the entire religion hinges on, the resurrection itself. The idea that Jesus died, was buried in a tomb, and then rose 3 days later has been repeated so often it feels unquestionable. But the truth is, the empty tomb story does not appear in the earliest Christian writings. Paul again says nothing about a tomb at all. He says Jesus was buried, but not where, not how, not in what. The idea of a sealed tomb guarded by Romans only appears decades later, in the Gospels of Matthew and others, and each of them contradicts the others. Mark, the earliest Gospel, ends with women discovering the tomb and running away in fear, telling no one. That was it. No appearances, no miracles, just silence. Later scribes added verses to Mark to force a resurrection appearance into the text. Yes, the earliest ending of Mark had to be modified to fit the rising doctrine. That is how desperate the early church was to patch the holes. Matthew adds guards at the tomb, Luke includes a dramatic walk to Emmaus, and John has Jesus appear to disciples multiple times, even letting Thomas touch his wounds. But none of these accounts agree. They are literary expansions, not historical records. Ask yourself, why would the single most important event in Christian theology, the resurrection, not be documented in a single independent historical source? Not one Roman report, not one temple record, not one non-Christian account. Why? Because the resurrection was never a historical event. It was a theological idea, a symbol of triumph over death, slowly written into the fabric of a religion that needed a climax. And if the resurrection is a lie, then what are we left with? A man whose life is undocumented, whose teachings were filtered through generations of editors, whose miracles left no trace, and whose death was rewritten a dozen different ways depending on the audience. What does that say about the truth behind the story? Consider this. Every religion in history has stories of gods dying and coming back. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Mithras in Persia. All of them had followers, rituals, and resurrection tales. Christianity was not the first to invent a dying and rising god. It was simply the one that survived through empire. And that survival depended on crafting narratives that could compete with and surpass the old myths. So the writers of the New Testament borrowed, repurposed, and restructured ancient ideas, stamping them with a Jewish name and Roman polish. That is how you create a religion that lasts. Not by telling the truth, but by constructing a myth powerful enough to replace older ones. And the empty tomb was the keystone of that myth. But if the tomb was never real, then the resurrection was never real. And if the resurrection was never real, then Christianity has no foundation. That is not just controversial, it is catastrophic for everything believers have been taught to place their trust in. Do not mistake the power of the story for the truth of history. A story can move hearts, change lives, even build civilizations. But it can also deceive, and when that story is repeated over and over, in every church, every Bible class, every holiday sermon, it becomes not just a tale, it becomes a prison of belief. You were told Jesus rose because it gave you hope, but the people who wrote those stories did it because it gave them power. And that power was never meant to free you, it was meant to control you. What would happen if that control collapsed? What would society look like if the most sacred event in Western religious tradition turned out to be nothing but smoke and scripture? We are only halfway through, and already the lies are unraveling faster than anyone wants to admit. If you feel that discomfort in your chest right now, that gnawing question that will not go away, that is the sound of truth finally knocking. Do not close the door. The next lies are even more devastating. If the resurrection never happened, then why did so many people believe it? Why were the Gospels written at all? And why do they tell us the same story, more or less, if it was all just made up? That brings us to lie number 7, the myth that the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. For most Christians over the age of 50, the idea that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John personally knew Jesus, or at least knew people who did, has been drilled in so deep it feels like a fact. But it is not. It is a lie. None of the Gospels are signed. None of them claim authorship in their original versions. The names were added later by church tradition, decades after the texts were first circulated. That means no one really knows who wrote the Gospels, and worse, whoever did write them was not there. Biblical scholars across the spectrum, from conservative to secular, agree that the Gospels were written between 40 and 70 years after the events they describe. That is 2 full generations of telephone game storytelling, political reinterpretation, and theological reshaping. And there is more. The Gospel of Mark, believed to be the first written, does not even include a full resurrection narrative in its earliest manuscripts. The original ending of Mark stops at chapter 16, verse 8, with women fleeing the empty tomb and telling no one what they saw. No risen Jesus, no appearances, no instructions. That was the end. It was only later scribes who added the rest, splicing in resurrection scenes borrowed from the other Gospels. Does that sound like eyewitness testimony? Or does it sound like literary editing designed to align the narrative with evolving doctrine? Now consider this. If Matthew and Luke had access to Mark, as most scholars believe, why do they contradict Mark and each other so often? One says Jesus' first sermon was on a mountaintop, the other says it was on a plain. One says Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great, the other says during the census of Quirinius, which occurred 10 years later. One says Jesus' last words were, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Another says, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Yet another says, "It is finished." How can the most sacred moment in Christian history, Jesus' final breath, have 3 completely different versions, all allegedly remembered by faithful followers? The answer is simple. They were not remembered. They were invented, crafted, tailored to fit different audiences. Matthew writes for Jews, so he emphasizes prophecy fulfillment. Luke writes for Gentiles, so he softens Jewish law and adds more compassion. John writes last, and his Jesus sounds like a cosmic being rather than a man. The difference is not just stylistic, it is theological. Jesus evolves from a humble preacher in Mark to a God walking among men in John. That is not eyewitness memory. That is mythological inflation. And this brings us to lie number 8, the contradictions in the Passion narratives. If Jesus' trial and crucifixion were real, historical events, they should be the most consistent accounts in the Bible, but they are not. Each gospel disagrees on major details. In Matthew, Judas throws the silver back and hangs himself. In Acts, written by the same author as Luke, Judas buys a field and falls headlong, spilling his intestines. In one version, the 2 thieves crucified with Jesus both mock him. In another, one repents and goes to paradise. The timeline of the crucifixion also shifts. John says Jesus was crucified the day before Passover. The others say it was on Passover itself. These are not small differences. They are timeline-altering contradictions that destroy any claim of factual reliability. Would eyewitnesses contradict each other on something as enormous as the hour their teacher died? Would they forget which day it happened? Or who was there? Or what he said with his final breath? Of course not. But anonymous authors writing decades later for different communities might very well insert their own versions of the story to make theological points. And that is exactly what we see. These are not historical records. They are religious propaganda. And once you understand that, the entire house of cards begins to collapse, because the cross was not just an execution, it was a symbol, and symbols can be reshaped, remixed, and reused to control the emotions of an audience. Ask yourself this: why does Jesus in John carry his own cross proudly, while in the others he stumbles and needs help? Why does John emphasize Jesus' divinity at the cross, while Mark focuses on his humanity and abandonment? These are not accidental discrepancies. They are deliberate rewrites, layered onto the story to match evolving dogmas. The Jesus of John is not the same as the Jesus of Mark. They are 2 different characters, shaped by different theological needs. And that should terrify anyone who ever believed these stories were inspired by the same God, because a divine truth does not need revision. A divine truth does not change shape based on who is listening. A divine truth does not contradict itself across 4 versions. But a man-made myth does, over and over again. If you are feeling the weight of these contradictions, it is because you are finally seeing what so many were never allowed to examine, that the Passion story, the trial, the betrayal, the crucifixion, and even the resurrection was never preserved as a sacred record. It was rewritten, edited, and customized to keep believers loyal and afraid to ask questions. If this does not disturb you, read those chapters again, side by side. Look for the differences. Count how many timelines break. Watch how the words change, the actions shift, the characters disappear or transform. This is not how history behaves. This is how fiction grows. Each edit, each contradiction, each retelling was another layer of the lie. And beneath all of it lies a truth so dangerous, so undeniable, that churches dare not speak it. The story of Jesus was never about truth. It was about control. And now that you have seen it, you can never unsee it. If the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus were rewritten, reshaped, and riddled with contradictions, then what kept the myth alive long enough to become an empire-spanning religion? That leads us directly into lie number 9, the myth of the early Christian martyrs. You have probably heard that the earliest followers of Jesus were so convinced of his resurrection, so unwavering in their faith, that they willingly faced torture, lions, fire, and crucifixion rather than deny their beliefs. That emotional image of brave men and women dying for Christ has been used for centuries to validate the faith. After all, who would die for a lie? But that question only holds weight if the stories are true, and they are not. Most of the martyrdom narratives that circulate today were written long after the events they supposedly describe. Take the tale of Peter being crucified upside down in Rome. There is no contemporary record of this. It appears only in apocryphal texts written more than a century later. The same goes for stories of Paul's beheading, the burning of Christians as torches by Nero, or the mass executions in arenas. These are tales passed down through generations of religious storytellers, not documented historical facts. And here is the kicker. Even the earliest Christian texts show no uniform picture of persecution. In fact, some early Christian writings, like the Didache and the Letters of Ignatius, indicate that Christian communities often lived peacefully and integrated with their pagan neighbors. So why fabricate martyrdom? Because it is the most powerful tool of manipulation. If you can convince people that your movement is built on the blood of heroes, that its truth is so sacred it cost lives, then any challenge to that narrative becomes sacrilege. It turns the belief into a battlefield and doubt into treason. But no religion has ever flourished because of how many died for it. Religions flourish because of how well they serve power. And that brings us to lie number 10, the final and perhaps most sinister fabrication. The idea that Christianity spread organically through grassroots evangelism and divine favor. The truth is far darker. Christianity did not conquer the world through miracles or martyrdom. It did so through imperial force, political alliances, and calculated rebranding. The Roman Empire, once a brutal enemy of Christians, became its greatest ally, not because of a spiritual awakening, but because of a political opportunity. In the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine faced a fractured empire, teetering on collapse. Paganism was no longer unifying. The gods of Rome were too many, too weak, too divided. He needed a single symbol, a central narrative, something that could unify millions across diverse lands. Christianity, with its promise of eternal order, moral authority, and already growing network of bishops and infrastructure, offered the perfect solution. So Constantine adopted the cross, not out of faith but out of strategy. He summoned the Council of Nicaea, standardized doctrine, and paved the way for the Nicene Creed, not to preserve truth, but to end theological infighting that threatened political stability. He merged state and church, giving the bishops imperial backing, and in return receiving divine legitimacy. And from that moment on, Christianity stopped being a movement of the poor and became the tool of emperors. Pagan temples were stripped and rebuilt as churches. Heretics were hunted. Doctrinal dissidents were branded enemies of both God and Rome. The Jesus of love and peace was replaced with the Christ of conquest and empire. And for the next 1,000 years, Christianity would expand not by grace, but by sword. Every step forward was accompanied by violence, coercion, or forced conversion. From the Crusades to the Inquisition, from the forced baptisms of indigenous peoples to the burning of libraries and temples, the so-called faith of the martyrs became the machinery of oppression. And what about the texts themselves? The Bible that so many revere as the pure word of God. That too was shaped under empire. Books were chosen, others rejected. Gospels that presented alternative views of Jesus, like the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary, were labeled heretical and destroyed. Councils of men motivated by politics and doctrine decided which texts would define eternity, and once that canon was locked, any deviation became punishable. This was not a religion rising on truth, it was a regime rising on narrative. Christianity became the Roman Empire in a robe, claiming heavenly authority while enforcing earthly dominance, and we are still living in the shadow of that power today. Every church built on stolen land, every cross raised above silenced traditions, every verse quoted to justify war, slavery, or discrimination, it all traces back to a time when myth was weaponized by empire. So ask yourself this: if Jesus preached humility, why did his followers build palaces of gold? If he called for peace, why did they wage holy wars? If he rejected power, why did they crown popes like kings? The answer is chilling. Because the Jesus who walked in sandals and healed the sick was not the Jesus who built Christianity. That Jesus was edited out, reshaped and rebranded to fit the needs of emperors, popes, and kings. And what we are left with is not the faith of Christ, but the faith of Constantine. The 10 lies that built Christianity were not innocent mistakes. They were deliberate strategies. Each one added another brick to the structure of belief, from the false birth story to the myth of martyrdom, from the forged gospels to the imperial takeover. It was never about truth. It was always about power. You are not just hearing a different version of history. You are witnessing the collapse of a story that controlled the world for 2,000 years. And if you have come this far, if these revelations have stirred something inside you, then subscribe right now, because the next truth we uncover might be the one they fear the most. So now that all 10 lies have been exposed, the false birthplace, the mistranslated virgin prophecy, the contradictory genealogies, the silence of history, the phantom witnesses, the inconsistent resurrection stories, the anonymous gospel authors, the incompatible crucifixion accounts, the myth of martyrdom, and the imperial hijacking of the faith, what are we really left with? A religion that claims to be built on divine truth, yet at every foundational level is tangled in human fabrication, historical distortion, and political agenda. And here is the deepest and most painful truth of all. It worked. For nearly 2,000 years, these lies were not just accepted, they were celebrated. They became untouchable pillars of culture, morality, and identity. People were born into these stories, raised under them, judged by them, and sent to war for them. These were not small fabrications. These were global constructions that shaped the fate of empires and the minds of billions. And even now, in the age of information, most people still have no idea how thoroughly manipulated the history of Christianity actually is. They still think Jesus was born in Bethlehem because of a Roman census that never happened. They still believe the Gospels were written by men who followed Jesus, not anonymous scribes shaping doctrine decades later. They still picture a divine resurrection when the earliest and most reliable texts show no such scene. They still revere saints and martyrs whose deaths were invented, whose heroism was fabricated to strengthen the illusion of divine favor. And above all, they still believe that Christianity spread because it was true, not because it was weaponized by emperors who saw in it the perfect vehicle for social control. But the more you look, the more undeniable it becomes. Every major point in the story, the birth, the death, the resurrection, the spread, is wrapped in contradiction, silence, or fraud. And here is a question that must be asked. If Jesus had never existed, would anything about this religion look different? Would the doctrines change? Would the holidays vanish? Would the churches empty? The frightening answer is no, because Christianity, as it exists today, does not depend on the man, it depends on the myth. The historical Jesus, if he ever lived at all, has been drowned in the flood of imperial rewriting, theological censorship, and manufactured miracles. The version most Christians worship today is not the peasant from Galilee. It is a construct, assembled from fragments of older religions, rewritten by political councils, and polished over centuries into something unrecognizable. And that construct has been used to justify crusades, inquisitions, colonizations, and genocides. It has been used to control sexuality, suppress science, manipulate governments, and silence dissent. That is not the legacy of a truth. That is the legacy of an empire disguised as faith. And here is the final reflection. If these 10 lies built Christianity, what does it say about the institutions still standing on them? What does it mean for the billions of people whose entire worldview is rooted in a narrative so thoroughly falsified? What does it mean for you? Maybe you feel shaken. Maybe you feel angry. Or maybe, for the first time, you feel free. Because when you tear down a lie, what you are left with is space for truth. Real truth. Not the kind that needs to be enforced by fear, dogma, or tradition. The kind that invites questions. The kind that welcomes doubt. The kind that grows. And if you have stayed with me through every one of these revelations, then you already know this is not just about Christianity. It is about power. It is about how easily people are controlled when they are handed a sacred story and told never to question it. It is about how myths become prisons, and how truth, real, raw, uncomfortable truth, is the only key that can open the door. So here is that key. Use it. Re-examine everything you were told. Look at the dates. Read the early texts. Trace the contradictions. Watch how theology was rewritten to match empire, and then decide for yourself. Do you want to keep living in the shadow of a lie, or do you want to step into the light of what is real? Because this is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new one where history is not owned by religion, one where you get to choose what to believe, and if you are ready to keep unmasking the greatest stories never told, then subscribe now, because this was just the first truth they hid, and there are many, many more.